Yesterday, I sat down with Congressman Mark Pocan over at the House Recording Studios and this is a fascinating conversation about a really, really important issue, the affirmative right to vote. Check this out. Congressman Mark Pocan is with us, representing the great state of Wisconsin, and thank you for sitting down with me.
Oh, absolutely, Tom. Thank you.
I'm very pleased to have this conversation. You are right at the leading edge of what is one of the most important issues in the country right now, and that is the affirmative right to vote. Why do you feel that there is a need for us to amend the Constitution or to pass legislation or to do anything to assert that there is a right to vote? Isn't it obvious everybody has a right to vote?
Yeah, I think everyone assumes that it's inherent in the Constitution is a right to vote, yet there isn't. There's protections against discrimination, but there's no affirmative right to vote. So what happens in the state of Wisconsin, where I was in the legislature for 14 years, and every other legislature in the country, they see these measures to inhibit voting, whether it be registration, early voting, photo IDs, etc. And what this essentially would do would put the burden on that state to prove that they're not causing a barrier to voting, rather than the person who has a barrier to voting through a photo ID or some other measure having to prove that they've been harmed. So it's that affirmative guarantee to vote. And in the state of Wisconsin, we've seen these measures when I was in the legislature come through.
Is it that right now, as an individual, you're sort of like presumed guilty until you prove you're innocent? You've got to demonstrate that you are eligible to vote, and the mechanism is turned upside down, and you're trying to right it?
Well, I think this is part of that
slippery... Is that a good metaphor?
Well, it's like the slippery slope of watching, the Republicans always finding ways to try to stop things too often, or those who want to stop voting rights have tried to find ways to inhibit who can vote. So I think when we started seeing the photo ID laws and then changes to early voting and changes to registration, this year alone there's 80 bills introduced in 30 states that would inhibit somehow someone's ability to vote. And
just this year?
Just this year, 2013. And there'll be more before the year's over.
Yeah, we're 5 months into the year.
Yeah, exactly. So this puts the burden on the state to have to then prove that it wouldn't somehow inhibit the vote. And we've seen long lines at polling places. In Wisconsin, our photo ID law actually was ruled unconstitutional because of our Wisconsin Constitution has an affirmative right to vote. And when we had two major court decisions explicitly said, because of our right to vote in the Wisconsin Constitution, that they stopped these laws that would have been more restrictive and affected seniors and low-income people and students from voting. So we saw it work in Wisconsin. We thought it would make strong sense to have this nationally, and that's why we're proposing it.
Wasn't, to a certain extent, Bush v. Gore the wake-up call for all of us? And if so, please explain or share with our viewers and listeners how so.
Sure. Well, it was explicitly said during the court case that there is not a right to vote in the Constitution. Which really probably was when what started some of these bills really fast-tracking realized, hey, there might be a little bit of a loophole in the law of how to, pull forward ways to inhibit that right to vote. So that court case is really fundamental. And coming from the state of Wisconsin, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Maine are usually 1, 2, and 3 in different order depending on the year for the turnout. We have some of the greatest turnout. So we're really proud of people being able to vote early. We have same-day registration and other measures that make sure someone has that ability. But when you hear that court decision and you see what was decided, we certainly saw the negative effect, and now what we're seeing in 30 states just this year alone.
All right. So what's the process?
The process is, it's a House resolution number 44. Right now we're getting co-sponsors. We literally just introduced it officially last week here in the House. We're having organizations look at it, gaining support that way. I think really pivotal are the two main Supreme Court decisions this year that we're going to hear on voting rights. That let's start this public conversation, because I think just as we started talking about this, people believe there is already a right to vote in the Constitution. There's not. And just this morning I did Wisconsin Public Radio. Someone called in who was calling in to oppose the law, and as they're listening to the conversation on their hold, they go, you know what, I've changed my mind after listening to this. Yes. And realizing that, instead of having many laws that affect voting, let's just make it fundamental. You have to prove, if you're going to pass a law, why it wouldn't stop someone from having that right. And I think, the process, if we do this now and have it go through this step and have it go through some of the interest groups that might be looking at this, we can really start building the movement you're going to need to actually get this to be passed. Because we know it's not an easy task, but we have to start that conversation, especially in light of all these laws.
So this is a House resolution which would become a bill, basically, that would call for a constitutional amendment.
Right. This is the beginning of the process to do that. And what we're hoping is by having this conversation right now, it'll build that momentum. Because again, I think the average person on the street supports it at a fundamental level. But how do we build the grassroots support?
Is this the constitutional amendment that you're proposing?
This is. Yeah, this is.
So it is the constitutional amendment?
Yes.
So is there somebody in the Senate who's introducing
No, not at this point. Right now it's Keith Ellison from Minnesota and I are the main authors. I think we've got about 6 or 7 original co-sponsors as we dropped the bill, and now we're gaining additional sponsors by talking about it as we put it out there.
Right. But it also has to happen in the Senate.
Yeah, absolutely. But this is the start of at least the process to do that.
Yeah. That is absolutely great. And with regard to this, ultimately, constitutional amendments not only have to be passed by the House and Senate by a supermajority, but they also have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Yeah. Are there state organizations? Are there state groups that are interested in this, that are working on this? What's happening out in the rest of the United States, outside the bubble here, the Beltway?
Sure. There's a number of fair vote groups that have already expressed interest on this, and in Wisconsin, United Wisconsin is taking some very grassroots steps to try to start build momentum for it. I think we're going to see that stretch again, especially as we see these 2 court decisions be decided by the Supreme Court. I think you're going to find more and more groups are going to look at this and say this is a good tool to talk about this a right that seems to be slipping away through state legislation. So I would guess that you'll find a number of groups that fit those constituencies, whether it be seniors or students or low income or other folks that are affected by some of the voting right laws that we're seeing restricting votes, will come out and continue to talk about this and why we have a need for this. Right. So we're just at that early process, literally a week or 2 into that process.
What can individual people do, people who are watching the program or listening to the program right now? What can they do to support your efforts, Congressman Pocan?
Yeah, I think reach out to your member of Congress and ask them to sign on to the bill. It's really important. The more you can get sponsors on, the more you continue to build interest in the bill. Write editorial, letters to the editor, etc. Do whatever you can to talk about this and get organizations they're with to try to sign up and have support for it. The more we can build this is only going to come from the grassroots. I mean, I don't expect the Koch brothers are going to come to our assistance anytime soon.
No, I think if anything, they're going to be opposing it.
Oh, exactly. I think they'll do everything they can to try to keep the laws in place that are or they're being proposed right now in all these other states. So we have to build this from the bottom up. We have to get the popular support. We have to get the people support for this. And if we can do that, we can definitely have that conversation about that fundamental right that we have to democracy is the right to vote. My brother and I have the exact same thing in common in one way with the Koch brothers, and that's we all have one vote and it counts as one vote. Right. So as much as they're going to take their money and use that influence to try to distort the process, we all have that fundamental equalizer and that right to vote, and we have to make sure everyone has that.
You're right. And there is no federal right to vote, and that's what you're working on.
Exactly.
And it's absolutely brilliant. Congressman Pocan, also I understand that you're gay and you have a husband, and your husband was just granted rights as the spouse of a member of the House of Representatives. Can you tell us about that?
Sure.
This is an historic thing.
Yeah, it was the first time in House history. What they've done up to this point, if you were a same-sex couple, your partner was your designee. Very romantic.
Yes.
This is my designee. And while opposite-sex couples have had the spousal ID for as long as the House has been around providing these IDs, we haven't had that right as a same-sex couple. So my husband and I were married 6.5 years ago in Toronto. I've been together over 10 years. So when they tried to offer us a designee ID, I asked for the reason in writing why they're denying it. Because if you're going to explore everyone's ID who gets married in Canada or another country, then I would understand. But I just wanted a written explanation, and they didn't want to provide that. So we've been pushing it for about 4.5 months, and thanks to Leader Pelosi's office, who's been extremely helpful, the House leadership officially said he could have that. And that's just an important step as we continue this process moving forward of making sure that we have full marriage equality and other equality. And I'm very proud that we were able to get that done in the House.
Full and equal rights for all.
Absolutely.
That's extraordinary.
Absolutely.
Congressman Pocan,
Yeah.
thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Tom. Really appreciate it.